How is it that UFOs can travel at 70, 80 times faster than anything we know of made by humans? How do they travel? How do they move? I've been fascinated to understand the technology behind UFOs. Forget all of the sightings and newspaper clippings. I want to see the science. How do these things actually maneuver? And how have pilots been stunned by these? Perhaps most famously, the USS Nimitz Tic Tac UFOs, which left pilots stunned at the speed at which they would move. David Sereda is a physicist and an expert in zero-point technology. He's been studying the movement of UFOs, what makes them fly, for decades, and he's our guest today on the Paranormal Post. And David, welcome to the show. So glad to have you here.
Clayton, it's really an honor to be sitting here with you because, you're telling me a little bit about your insights and your, how this subject beckons you and how it pulls you in. And for me as a kid growing up in Berkeley, California, 7 years old, 1968, I went to this school called Cornell Elementary School, and we were living in the University Village while my dad was getting a PhD, 4 boys, and I built model airplanes and hot rod cars, so I was very knowledgeable visually what things that flew, what craft flew, and what they looked like. And I knew what the Goodyear blimp looked like. I knew what airplanes looked like. I had been to air shows, and this one day coming home from school, it was a clear sunny day, which is pretty rare in the San Francisco Bay Area. You get a lot of fog, you get huge levels of fog. But this was a perfectly clear day, and all of a sudden, everyone on the streets is going crazy over this object up in the sky, and people are knocking on neighbors' doors, and everyone's coming outside, and you see this clear, double lenticular, metallic saucer hovering there, and it didn't go away, and it was close enough that you could see no rivets. You could see the little dome on the top. I mean, so classic. Except for this is modern ufology era. So as a kid, the only thing I could relate to is the Starship Enterprise because I watched Star Trek, and I said, oh, it must be the USS Enterprise.
Right.
And my mom would buy my brothers and I the little Star Trek shirts with the little emblem on them. So that was my only point of reference. And jumping forward way in the future, I'm sitting at the Berkeley, Space Lab up on the hill, the Lawrence Berkeley National Lab, with legendary physicists Glenn Seaborg, Bogdan Maglich, and Albert Ghiorso. And Seaborg chaired the Atomic Energy Commission under Kennedy, Johnson, and Nixon. He authorized all nuclear testing at the Nevada test site and nuclear rocket propulsion systems. And I decided, here I am with these legendary physicists, and Albert Ghiorso next to him is probably one of the most brilliant particle physicists in the history of the world, including Bogdan Maglich, who's an MIT PhD, Rutgers professor. And Maglich was pursuing a benign form of non-radioactive nuclear helium-3 fusion, and he was very close, and Seaborg was a supporter. And we're just having lunch, on the picnic tables. And I started telling Seaborg, when I was a kid, my dad was working on his PhD at the university in psychology, and I saw this flying saucer. And I described the same thing I described to you. And he was dead serious. I mean, he looked at me and Ghiorso looked at me, and they said, if you can attain anti-gravity, you have a power source, not a propulsion, a power source far greater than nuclear fusion. Because nuclear fusion drives, later when I was working for Maglich on fusion, I had these long conversations with Dr. Earl Van Landingham, who was head of all space and access technology at NASA. So he was the head of all propulsion technology. And Earl told me on the phone that Maglich's helium-3 reactor would produce 18 million electron volt charge protons. So high energy protons could be fired out of the back of a drive, and you could control like a lens that closes and opens and lets more or less proton energy out, and you could reach a tenth the speed of light, right? So That's incredible. So when I told Maglish that, I said, NASA wants your fusion funded because if we fund it, we could get up to a tenth the speed of light. And Maglish said, that's really ironic that he said that, because he said helium-based protons, of course, are very light. They have low mass, right? So, hydrogen and helium and oxygen are the first, they're really the super light end of the periodic table of elements. And Maglish said what you really need is heavy ion thrust as a form of ion propulsion. But Seaborg said to me, if you have anti-gravity, you're beyond thrust, because anti-gravity is not thrust. And that is a key point that Seaborg made, because in these Navy pilot testimonies and looking at the infrared photography of
And you're
the
referring
UFOs,
to the USS Nimitz famous
right,
videos that we've now seen.
2004 USS
Right.
Nimitz. And I've analyzed that footage frame by frame by frame in the
Right, which is
editing
one of the
bay.
reasons I wanted to have you on, because of the way that you analyze those frame by frame by frame. What did you notice when you analyzed what those dash cam video, I don't want to call them dash cam, infrared videos that this is from a layperson, a dash cam. I'm thinking like
These are Raytheon full,
right, FLIR
they have
cameras.
incredible spectra. And you have to understand, okay, I'm a skydiver. I trained at Edwards Air Force Base. I've jumped from 30,000 feet. So when you go into high altitude environments, the temperature outside, this was November 2004 on the Nimitz, it can be minus 70 at 20,000 feet, 30,000 feet. It drops. The temperatures are unbelievably low. So that means your background on your infrared is black, right? So any heat, even ambient heat or heat bubbles, will appear in contrast to that background on these super infrared cameras. But thrust will also appear. Thrust is going to appear because thrust is heat. And therefore, there were no evidence in this photography, in these cameras they're using, of any type of thrust. And that means we're looking at something super advanced. Now, here's the other problem, because what Leslie Kean missed in the New York Times, where a lot of amateurs are able to distort this story of the Navy pilot testimony, is you don't have a speed chart. So if I give you a speed chart of how fast was David Fravor's, his airplane was able to go about top 1,700 miles an hour. That's tops. Basically, dropping from 80,000 feet to sea level in 0.78 seconds is over 60,000 miles an hour. 60,000 miles an hour.
So wait, say that again. So dropping from where they were.
From above, now radar can see 200 miles. That I've confirmed from a radar specialist. And if you can drop from 80,000 feet, now the question is, they said above 80,000 feet to sea level in 0.78 seconds, right? But that data changed depending on who conducted the interview, right? But that data came from a very top publication magazine. And so then I saw on the interviews in Unidentified, the series Unidentified, you'll see the same person say that it dropped from above 80,000 feet to sea level, 0.78 seconds, and then they'll say 25,000 feet in 0.78 seconds. So there's a discrepancy. So my calculations...
What do you make of that discrepancy?
Well, I need to interview the pilots, because I understand propulsion, I understand G-forces and acceleration. I've experienced a lot of those things as a skydiver who is trained at the Air Force, and I've jumped from 30,000 feet. So when you understand that we're made mostly of water, right? We're about 87% water. So any sudden acceleration is going to throw that water mass in the body backwards. And accelerations from 200, let's say they're doing 200 nautical miles per hour, to suddenly going 25,000 miles an hour, because some of the testimony from the pilots talk about the 20 to 25,000 mile an hour range. So I would say that's a low projection on their speed. But let's do a speed chart. So when you do a speed chart, you say, what are the speeds of all of our current supersonic aircraft? And then you got to check our missiles, right? And if you just go right to the top, most of our fighter jets are doing Mach 2, Mach 1.5, Mach 2, Mach 3. So 700 and something miles an hour at sea level times each Mach level. Most pilots are not reaching 2,000 miles an hour. Most of them are not. And our stealth jets are not that fast either because they rely on stealth rather than velocity and speed, right? So when you get to our missiles, our fastest missile is the ICBM Minuteman. It'll peak at 18,000 miles an hour. But the reason it can go so fast is it will go way, way up above the Earth's atmosphere and drop straight down on its target. So when you're seeing things that can move suddenly to 15, 25,000 miles an hour and maybe as high as 67,000 miles an hour, then you're seeing something that no physical living thing could survive. Okay, remember, they drop from above 80,000 feet to sea level and they stop on a dime. Do you know what happens at that speed? That's 60 something thousand miles an hour. Now let's say they're doing 20 something thousand miles an hour and they stop on a dime. You're dead. And in fact, the way we build airplanes today, which is basically a frame with a very light metal casing, and then you have your thrust engine, your technology on the inside. These things are light. They're not heavy. And therefore, the G-forces on a sudden stop will structurally crush the craft and the pilot. They'll be crushed. And that problem alone eliminates the idea that these are foreign enemy aircraft from the Chinese or the Russians or whomever.
Right. I mean,
Because
doesn't that totally throw this out the window? I mean, Senator Marco Rubio has said we want to analyze this in case, I'm hoping that it's not the Chinese, hoping that it's not the Russians.
Can't be them.
Any human body, given the technology that we understand, would be ripped apart at those speeds, right?
At those speeds and sudden stops and sudden, so you can slowly accelerate to those speeds. And you won't experience the level of G-forces I'm talking about. But with sudden stops from 20,000 miles an hour down, even our best airplanes won't structurally survive that stop. They just won't. And when pilots fly high altitude, when you get above 30,000 feet and you go way up there, you're going to need a pressure suit. And the pressure suit holds your skin, your face, it holds everything together, right? That's why we pressurize cabins. And, I've experienced a sudden decompression of a cabin in a pressure chamber at Edwards Air Force Base, and it looks like a bomb went off. When the outside air meets the compressed inside air, you get a differential, which produces a massive kind of an explosion that goes off. And I got tested for that. I got tested for hypoxia, oxygen starvation to the brain. And physiologically, to perform the way these things are performing, okay, first you have to eliminate humans because no human could structurally survive those accelerations that sudden. And when I hear news reports of bugs and optical illusions from physicists, I mean, come on, you guys, these are trained pilots. A trained pilot knows every enemy aircraft, make, model, and number, and they know every missile, and they know the capacity and velocity of every missile. So even the new Russian supersonic missile, which in a lower atmosphere, which means more dense, right? That when you go to high altitude, the air gets less dense and therefore you can travel faster. But Russia's got a supersonic missile that can do 7,000-ish miles an hour, but that's still not fast enough. See, when you build your speed chart, all of our missiles, Sidewinder missiles, and it doesn't matter which Tomahawks, none of those missiles can touch these UFOs in velocity.
So what do you think, based on all of your experience, David? You're looking at this, you're analyzing these frame by frame based on all of your experience. When you're When you're looking at these craft, when you're looking at this video, what do you think they are?
Well, firstly, when I was going frame by frame, and I understand cameras very well and how they function, in a single frame, the UFO, and this is the USS Nimitz footage, it will suddenly split in two, and then it will come back together. And then several frames later, it splits in two again. And nobody else has done this but me. And what that means is you have to understand quantum functions. You have to go back to these early, Heisenberg, Bohr, double slit experiments, where if you put two slices in a piece of cardboard or a wooden target or any target, the same electron will go through both slices at the same time. And an electron has a little bit of mass. And so I believe these craft have to go into a state where they've reduced the mass energy of the structure of the metal to an extremely low state where it could be as light as an electron. And therefore, if your mass is low, your g-forces on acceleration are low. But that would mean they would have to do the same thing to the pilot. And when you look at the idea of exotic things like wormholes, because we have data from Sean Cahill, who's one of the Navy officers.
Yeah.
He's one, and Sean, I wrote him an email, something that is too shocking for the world right now, and it has to do with the Space Shuttle Columbia being taken out by a super weapon. And I have the good photographic evidence from NASA's cameras of that and possibly being taken out by UFOs. But the what starts to happen...
Will you share that with me, David? I would love to.
I would have to do another interview because this is so precise. I have photographs, letters from the Air Force and MIT alumni. The Space Shuttle Columbia was taken out by some kind of UFO.
Wow.
And it was not a super lightning strike, and that's a massive story. It would terrify the nation. And I have this very precise data on this. So Sean Cahill sees these UFOs go in this kind of counterclockwise star pattern. It almost reminds me of electrons in their various shells around the nucleus of the proton and the neutron in an atom. And when they start to go around, they disappear through what appears to be a stargate. And the radar data says the point of disappearance is just north of Guadalupe Island off the coast of Catalina. And this disappearance point happens to be precisely in alignment with the north longitude of the Great Pyramid of Egypt. So if you take 29 point something degrees and go around the planet, you come right to the Great Pyramid of Egypt, and the UFOs disappeared north of Guadalupe Island right at that point. And what's interesting about that point is the data showed a magnetic anomaly under the ocean just north of that. And with that magnetic anomaly...
Let me get this straight, because you've been sleeping on this for a long time. You've been steeped in this. You're blowing the mind. You're blowing my mind. I'm sure you're blowing the mind of my audience right now. That you're studying frame by frame. You witness this craft. We're talking about the Tic Tac disappear in the blink of an eye at the precise location, which is in perfect alignment with the Great Pyramid of Giza in Egypt. What do you make of that? Do you believe that there's some sort of an interdimensional wormhole at that precise location? What do you...
See, if you study the magnetic field of the Earth and you look at the North and the South poles, right, and you understand magnetism the way I do, you see, everything is magnetic. Everything. You see, here's some copper, and this is a magnet. And you would say, well, a magnet doesn't care about copper, it only cares about iron, right? But if I drop this magnet through the copper, it will float and almost levitate down through the copper. And that's because the copper, see, every metal is either ferromagnetic, which means it can be permanently magnetized, or it can be diamagnetic, which means what the magnetic charge of a magnet will produce a like charge against the the magnetic charge of a non-magnetic material, and then you have paramagnetism, which is the opposite of that. So everything responds to a magnetic field, even copper, even zinc, everything. So we know so little about magnetism, and we think we know a lot, but the way these UFOs are behaving is everything corresponds to magnetism. Hence, the magnetic anomaly that was detected just north of Guadalupe Island, which is approximately where the radar says the UFOs all disappeared. Okay, so then you have the north-south magnetic fields of the Earth, and then on the sides of the Earth, you get these little vortice kind of spinners on different angles and different sides of the Earth's magnetic field. And those magnetic fields could be openings or portals, and it's possible that on this north latitude you have longitude, latitude, but the north latitude line of where this magnetic anomaly is corresponds to where the UFOs disappeared, happens to be in perfect alignment to the Great Pyramid of Giza. So that means this can't be just coincidence. And I can do the same thing with a paranormal ranch called Skinwalker Ranch in Utah, which is at 40-something degrees north latitude. And why did we make Area 52? My old friend Boyd Bushman, who was a senior scientist at Lockheed Martin for over 20 years, and he passed away, a few years ago. He told me we moved Area 51 to Area 52 in Tooele, Utah. And that's where Area 52 is. Now, here's Skinwalker Ranch, 40-something degrees. Here's Area 52 right next to it. So if you're looking at the U.S. map, the Area 52 is just to the left of the Skinwalker Ranch. You go all the way around the planet and you come to Mount Olympus, the mountain of the gods of the ancient Greeks. Is that a coincidence? I don't think so. Because now we have two cases of phenomena that correspond to this kind of magnetic alignment. So therefore, if you look, let's go to the East Coast. Lieutenant Ryan Graves describes cubic UFOs with spheres inside, and the edges of the cube protrude just beyond the edge of the sphere. And I'm interested in measurements, but I'm also interested in performance and aerodynamics in this case. Because you're going to go all the way back to Time Magazine. Major Bob White, one of the test pilots of the X-15. He's going Mach 4 and 5 in the X-15. And outside of his window, he sees a rectangular UFO, non-aerodynamic, going the same speed right next to him, checking him out, right? So that's not aerodynamics. When you're looking at a cube in a sphere, that's not aerodynamic.
Right, we're talking Star Trek. We're talking Borg, right?
Exactly. The cube, man. The cube. Like go back to Transformers. The cube, right?
Right.
And the cube, we go all the way to Solomon's Temple, and the first Holy of Holies in the Tabernacle, where the Ark of the Covenant was stored, was a cubic tent that was 10 by 10 by 10 royal cubits. And the Queen's Chamber in the Great Pyramid is 10 by 10 by 10 royal cubits. And then the King's Chamber is 10 by 20 royal cubits, which is equivalent to Moses' holy place, the holy tent that extends out of the Holy of Holies. Now, in Solomon's time, the Holy of Holies became a cube 20 by 20 by 20 cubits, which arguably, depending on which royal cubit you use, I use the one in the Great Pyramid, comes to 34.34 feet. And that's right within the size range of what Lieutenant Graves is saying. And this is why I think it's so important for him to get together with a sketch artist and sketch precisely what you saw, because he had ocular, visual contact with this thing. And we see special effects that are very poor in identifying. I want to know metallic hue. I want to know which metal this thing was made out of. And you can show him 100 different metal samples until you get the right one. And I know the UFO I saw, because I've done the same test, I think I have a piece of it around here somewhere, is tungsten. And tungsten has incredible properties. This is tungsten. It's heavy stuff. This is pure tungsten rod. and every metal has a color hue, a tonal hue. And this hue is important because it's going to give us some of the secret to how these craft are able to cancel out drag, right? Because drag is when air pressure hits the wing and the structure of an airplane, and it produces pressure. That pressure is drag, and if you reduce the drag, then you can go faster. Well, we know a cube is going to produce massive drag, so it's not using a propulsion in the sense that we understand. And then when you understand the concept of canceling out drag, inertia, and to explain Einstein's problem of how if you start approaching the speed of light, no structural mass can reach the speed of light, because the faster you go, the background environment you're moving through starts pushing on you. And it's similar to drag, but in space, where you get out of the Earth's atmosphere, space has mass and it has energy. So when you push against it, the faster you go, the heavier you become. And then your craft will eventually become equal to an infinite amount of mass, and it requires an infinite amount of energy to go any faster. And you can't do it because it takes all the energy in the universe to go faster. But if you reduce the mass, gravity effect, mass and gravity are proportional in Einstein's equation, to zero or near zero, you can therefore create a wormhole, a zero mass wormhole. And we know what produces zero mass wormholes. They're called semiconductor holes, or what you call quantum tunneling events that occur at the quantum level in certain materials more than others. And crystals can generate electron holes and semiconductor holes, and so can certain metals. So I think as this story has come to apparently the newest story in the New York Times is that we're in possession of rare exotic metals or materials that were engineered by whomever made these craft. The secret lies in the materials that they're using, and how they're able to electrify those materials to produce the reduced mass gravity effect, what I call reducing the mass.
So that's where you think this whole story hinges. So we see this most recent New York Times story, which is that the U.S. government has in its possession materials from off-world vehicles, to quote the New York Times piece. Do you think it's that material itself that's more important than just about anything else?
It's more important than anything, and here's why. And here's why. Because there is a case that goes all the way back to the J. Edgar Hoover files, and I have this case, and it describes a kid who worked at a gas station, and he built a toy flying saucer out of an exotic type of aluminum. I mean, there are many different types of aluminum, and he used a transmitter tube in the middle of it. He sandwiched the two sides together, and it levitated. And the event occurred on July the 8th, 1947, which is right in tandem with the Roswell event. But his saucer got really hot, caught on fire, and crashed in this woman's yard on Magnolia Boulevard. And the fire department came and put the fire out, took pictures of it. And what I say to myself is, how did this kid figure this out?
Right.
He was a teenager. He worked at a gas station. I think it was a Chevron station in 1947. I don't know if we had Chevron stations in 1947, because I was born in 61. But nevertheless, that's what the report said. So what he made is what's called a resonant wave cavity. A cavity means, and when I was working, for Department of Defense on landmine and bomb technology and nuclear fusion, one of the things I personally studied is which metals can you use to trap an electromagnetic wave. So if I take two pieces of copper, put them together, and I put a transmitter inside, the electromagnetic energy will go through the copper like it's not even there. And this was important in nuclear fusion because you need to build what's called a wave trap, where the energy gets so dense in there and it doesn't escape through the membrane, the copper or whatever you're using, so that you don't have this mass energy loss. And I found, believe it or not, that we use tungsten containers of this metal here to carry nuclear gamma ray emitting radioactive materials around, because it's better than lead at trapping electromagnetic energy. So that would explain why the UFO I saw was made out of tungsten, because it creates a wave trap. And if you create a wave trap, which is what this kid did, it freaking flew. And that's why I'm interested in all the exotic metals that different people are finding in these crash retrievals, because I think the secret to anti-gravity is building a wave trap, and that's what a flying saucer is. No seams, no rivets. You'll hear this every time. In the Stephenville mile-wide UFO, where Air Force pilots were chasing this huge UFO in the Stephenville, Texas case, this one farmer describes coming up underneath it, no rivets anywhere. And you can't have holes or seams because the electromagnetic radiation will escape.
And very little sound. I mean, like a low hum as well, right?
A low hum. Right, and that's what this kid did. This case really interests me. And so building wave traps I built one, and there are incredible paranormal things that happen when you build one. And I had an object disappear in the room, and I have this right down to a science. The whole science of building wave traps interests me more than anything, because we know in quantum mechanics, if you trap an electron in a wave trap, it will cause a quantum tunneling event to occur. And quantum tunneling events generate faster than light energies. And really, they're almost like micro wormholes. And we know very little about them, but if I've studied a lot of old solid state physics to understand what these micro little wormholes can do. And I think we're very close to a new understanding in how these craft may be working. But
can you connect some of the dots for us, David? Because I mean, if I'm sitting here listening to this, I'm saying all of these individual things sound absolutely amazing. It's hard, I think, for the average person to try to then wrap their head around the entirety of this. When you look at Bob Lazar at Area 51 and the stories of what he saw with reverse engineering craft at Area 51 and seeing craft.
Yeah, stop right there, though, for a moment. You got something really important there. So when I was sitting there with Seaborg and Ghiorso at the Lawrence Berkeley lab, Ghiorso and Seaborg were the ones looking for the super massive particles. In fact, if you go to your periodic table of elements, you come past uranium, and Seaborg won the Nobel Prize with Macmillan for the discovery of the explosive uranium isotope that was used in atomic bombs. And then you'll see a Seaborgium, which a particle was named after him. And element 115 is way past Seaborgium. And I was telling Seaborg about element 115 and Lazar. And those two guys, Ghiorso, you can Wikipedia him. I mean, Ghiorso is unbelievable. These guys knew how to find those super massive particles, and they knew how to do it. And what Lazar did in his team is they found Russian scientists that were the ones looking towards element 115. But now we've gone past 115. And I'm trying to think to myself, was the 115 used for one or two components of the UFO in the Lazar case? I don't think Lazar knew. It has nothing to do with the anti-gravity. It has to do with the quantum tunneling. You only need a fraction of a second, which is today, you can only produce element 115 for a tiny fraction of a second. So that we've been able to produce 115, but we can't make a stable form of it. But you don't need a stable form of it. To open up a micro wormhole, a quantum tunneling event that is super massive, you only need it to exist for a billionth of a second.
So David,
and the craft
if I have my 10-year-old son, and he says, I see that you're sitting there interviewing David Sereda. What does David believe? And if you had to explain it to my 10-year-old son, what you think when you see these USS Nimitz videos. If you had to say to my son in just a few minutes and had to explain it to him as a bedtime story, and I'm not even joking because I'm even trying to wrap my head around it, talk to me as if I'm 10 years old. These craft, they're moving with some incredible anti-gravity propulsion without thrust, not giving off any kind of a heat signature. They're using quantum tunneling technology to go from point A to point B in a way that human bodies would be ripped apart even on stopping, starting. How would you explain that to my 10-year-old son?
It's funny because my daughter, who just interrupted us, is 10 years old, and I was 7 years old when I saw this UFO in 1968. And following that appearance, I had dreams of the ETs showing me the power drive to their craft, and I saw this clockwise, counterclockwise lights spinning on the same axis. And I didn't understand what that meant as a kid, but I can tell a 10-year-old kid that basically the faster you try to travel, the more the mass of the air will push on you, which makes you heavier and heavier and heavier. And then you want to go faster against that. It's similar. I was doing this yesterday with my little daughter. I was kayaking against the river, the flow of the river. And I have to work 10 times as hard to go against the river than to go with it. So I believe in the universe there are finer and finer substrata to the background of space. So water is super heavy. Our atmosphere is super heavy. When I skydived from 30,000 feet, I was doing 300 miles an hour. When I hit the lower atmosphere, it was like jumping into a lake. My oxygen mask just started rattling like crazy. I had to grab it, hold it steady because it was trying to rip off my face. Air is very dense. And then when you get into space, it's lighter. You can go faster. But it's not as light as you think it is. It's got weight to it. It's got mass. So imagine that these craft don't try to fight all that, but they produce a quantum tunneling event that takes them to a place some physicists call hyperspace. And in this hyperspace, that density doesn't exist. And you can move from point A to point B with almost no resistance at incredible speed. Imagine two.
Is it minute? I mean, is it happening so if you have a craft that's, 20 meters long, or like the craft that you saw in Berkeley, is the quantum tunneling happening right around the craft, or is it meters away? Do you have a sense of where in spatial relationship to the UFO it's happening?
That's a really, really deep question. So when you go to Lieutenant Brian Graves' incident and the footage on the East Coast, you'll see this UFO just change angle, and then boom, it accelerates. And I was watching my little daughter play with some magnets. And if you play with, I have so many magnets around here. And if you play with one magnet at a distance to another, you can manipulate the distant magnet to the magnet in your hand, right? Like you can take a piece of metal, even like this piece of metal here, and this magnet. Well, you see, this metal is starting to move in my hand. You see that?
Right.
You see how it's moving? I'm waving a magnet above the one that's wobbling, and that's what it looked like in the Lieutenant Brian Graves, the footage from his case, where this UFO, they're following it, they're really excited, and it just changes angle, and then boom. And what that looks like is the way a magnet works is that inside of a material like steel, we have dipoles. We have positive and negative little poles like magnets, and they're scattered in all different directions. But in a ferromagnet like iron or nickel or neodymium, we can run an electric charge and permanently place a lot of those dipoles in the same orientation of north-south magnetic field. And that's what makes a magnet permanent. Whereas non-permanent magnets like copper, you can run a magnet by the copper and feel the resistance, but you can't permanently change those poles. What the UFO looks like in the East Coast case, to me, it looks like because this will answer your question. It looks like it may have some monopole magnetic beam that's aligned to something in front of it, and then it just chases after it. And a monopole is a magnet that doesn't have a north-south. It's just either positive or negative. And most physicists today, Michio Kaku would agree, a monopole can violate Einstein's inertial mass problem and travel with the speed of light and possibly beyond. So that makes me, when I look at the data on these tests, on this photography from the infrared photography, it looks like, and I've studied magnetism deeply, it looks like we're absolute amateurs in magnetism. We're looking for thrust and increased thrust. So when we think of element 115, we think of supermassive thrust. So let's look at the idea of supermassive thrust. Do you know what supermassive sudden acceleration thrust would do to the local environment where it's escaping from? It would destroy it. It would destroy it like a bomb.
I mean, my frame of reference is Cape Canaveral. I lived in Orlando, and when there would be a shuttle launch from Cape Canaveral, you could hear it in Orlando, which is about an hour away. And you would see it in the whole, even in Orlando, you'd be vibrating with, you'd feel the tremors in Orlando an hour away from Cape Canaveral.
See, Clayton, that's an incredible description right there. So think of the space shuttle and how heavy it is, and it's lifting off, and you can feel those vibrations an hour away. Now, with these UFOs suddenly accelerating at speeds beyond the space shuttle, way beyond it, there was no such vibrational impact, which means that's not how they're doing it. Because if they were using an element 115 for something equivalent to a thrust, element 115 is so supermassive as a thrust wave that it would destroy everything behind it. I mean, like a bomb. It would be devastating. It would punch a hole in the earth. But I think the element 115 story is true. I just don't think Lazar was brought in, right? He was brought in he was very young at the time. The guy was not very old. He's like first, second year of college kind of guy. He doesn't have a PhD in anything at that age. No way. But they brought him in probably because they wanted fresh, young minds. And he thought the element 115 was the anti-gravity, but I'm saying it's not. The anti-gravity is easier than that. All you need is a wave trap. And my friend Boyd Bushman at Lockheed Martin definitely agrees with me on this point of what happens when you trap electromagnetic energy and it can't escape. Now, that's not easy to do right there, because every element on the periodic table I've tested, the electromagnetism will go right through it like it's not like a window. Like it's not, you can't stop it. You can't stop it. But there is a way to stop it. There is a way to stop it. And there's some more exotic ways to trap waves by using really powerful magnetic fields to trap electromagnetic energy to produce lift. Because there is one force that's violating gravity all the time, and that's electromagnetism, light. So light will hit the earth and it will escape the earth, and the gravity won't pull it down back to the earth. It's the only thing escaping earth. Now, if you can make that really dense, really dense in a cavity, that same force, it will lift in the same way helium will lift a balloon. But that's only function number one of the UFO. It can't travel. Here's another problem. Let's say you're doing a tenth the speed of light and you hit a rock. It'll put a hole right through you, right? You can't turn. You see a meteor coming or you see some debris coming. You can't turn at that speed. Even if you slowly accelerate to 67 miles an hour, 67 million miles an hour, you can't turn because the G-force will kill you on the turn. The faster you go, you can't turn because the G-forces increase with velocity on a turn. That's another thing any of these pilots can tell you. That's why we haven't gone much faster. Like when Major Bob White flew the X-15 at Mach 4 and 5, and I think he reached 6, you can't turn. It's a rocket. And he sees a rectangular UFO outside the window. This is in Time magazine. You can't do that with aerodynamics. A rectangle can't fly. So they figured out something else. And until we get past this idea that we need more thrust power to go faster, we have to start thinking in a completely different way. We have to start exploring magnetic fields and magnetism way deeper than we ever did at Bell Labs in the early days to
So with
solve
these
this
different
riddle.
elements and all of that, what we know, and of course these big bombshell stories in the New York Times, you've been on the cutting edge of this. You're probably years ahead of what this reporting will reveal, but it takes a long time for these sources to come out and people who work in the government to admit it. Do you think that the United States government has these materials in its possession? Do you think that they have craft that they've been working on, reverse engineering? And if so, how close do you think we are to replicating that technology?
Well, Boyd Bushman showed me photographs in person in a videotaped interview of what looked like regular airplanes, but then a crane is lowering an anti-gravity device into the belly of the craft so that if someone took a picture of it, they think, oh, well, that's an airplane. But it's actually hovering using anti-gravity. And what percentage of gravity they're canceling in those experiments, I don't know. But I do know this. In the Betty Cash Landrum incident, also in Texas, there was a lot of radiation that Betty Cash and her family were exposed to. And what Boyd has told me is we're using miniature nuclear type of drives to power some of these anti-gravity experiments. When I told Boyd Bushman my idea, because my ideas come from the problem in nuclear fusion, and what the three criteria for fusion are containment, confinement, time, and fuel density, right? But you increase density and you increase confinement by trapping your electromagnetic energy in a magnetic field so that it doesn't escape, and that collapsing pressure crushes your nuclear fuel to produce fusion. And Magwitch was ahead of everybody. Magwitch had produced ion temperatures of 10 billion degrees, whereas the tokamak fusion reactors were fighting to get 100 million degree temperatures. But they were monopolizing all the money in Congress. I spoke in the United States Congress with Magwitch and Harry Hamlin from LA Law and many brilliant award-winning physicists in 1994 in the House of Representatives. And, you know, Magwitch is just way over everybody's heads. His physics was way over everybody's heads. And Seaborg was a supporter of Magwitch, but at that time, by the time Seaborg was supporting Magwitch, the way we appropriate funding and spending in defense is today too corrupt. It's too much of a buddy system. So your senators and your representatives will send money to defense contractors that they like. But if you're talking about, this is Earl Van Landingham, the head of all space access and technology at NASA. He wants Congress to fund Magwitch because he only needs about $50 million and will not only have fusion, but will have super fast propulsion systems. And Earl told me on the phone, I mean, I don't even know if Earl's still alive and if he can even hear this, but I know Magwitch is dead. Magwitch passed away. And I spoke to Magwitch just before he died. There was nothing wrong with the guy. He was about to get a $50 million contract with the U.S. government for his nuclear fusion. And I said, how's your health? He's swimming every day. All of a sudden he dies. Doesn't get the contract. And see, there's a buddy system in the military. And the buddy system is wrong. The person who should get the funding is the person who's the best at what they're doing. The person who's going to propel the U.S. arsenal of velocity and space and Air Force dominance. The person who's going to do the best job should get the money, not the person who's the buddy of the general. It can't work like that. And right now we're in a situation where, you know, Russians have supersonic missiles that can do 7,500 miles an hour at low altitude and take out most tactical strikes against them. Now, I don't think that's the direction. The idea that these UFOs can outdo every missile on the planet, because nothing is still faster than the Minuteman. Nothing. Although it's not a tactical missile, it's very big. The smaller tactical missiles still can't touch these UFOs. And that's why, just on an elementary level, what the New York Times need to do is interview me, and I'll give you a proper speed chart and then put it next to the UFOs with all the data we have. And that'll end the story right there. These are not from this earth. And when you understand, disappearing at the same north latitude as the Great Pyramid of Egypt, there is something going on here on this earth that is way over our heads. It's way over our heads. And we need to explore it. We need to find out.
I agree. That's why you're here.
We can learn from it, and we can better humanity from it. We can have a benign source. Like, I would like to see myself. I don't like the idea of buying oil and making the Saudis rich so they can come to America and buy all the real estate and buy everything they want. I want every car to be electric, but I also want to see a fusion power source. I would like to see Magwich's fusion, even though he's passed away. It can be revived. I know more about it than just about anybody alive because I spent 20 years with him. I like to see it revived. I like to see his dream come true of a non-radioactive miniature. Like, Magwitch he funded 3 models. Shell Oil put in 10 million years ago. He built 3 prototypes. In his 3rd prototype, Major General D. Lamberson at the Kirtland Air Force Base in New Mexico, I've been on that base, he did feasibility studies on Magwich's final design for proof of concept of a cubic meter non-radioactive nuclear reaction space using deuterium and helium-3 fuel would produce 1 billion watts of continuous power with no harmful radiation. That's what the end result of the Super Crate 2 study showed.
What happened?
That he would succeed.
I mean, this could be.
That's Major General D. Lamberson. You can Wikipedia him too. Lamberson, again, we go to Congress with all these studies, and this is under the Clinton-Gore era. Gore didn't even show up in Congress when he was buddies with Harry Hamlin from LA Law. He's supposed to show up. He never showed up. Why didn't you fund this? Why did this get slipped through everybody's fingers? Because of the buddy system. Right. Well, Magwitch isn't my buddy.
Is it go back to Tesla? You're not a part of the buddy system. You get squashed.
I know, if you're not part of the buddy system, you get squashed, and that will produce the failings of America. Like, Nikola Tesla came from Yugoslavia, a landed U.S. immigrant, the true father of radio, alternating current, remote control, the first solar cosmic arrays of capturing radiant energy, faster than light radio signaling. Tesla was a genius, and he was not a born American. He's not a born American. But J.P. Morgan financed him up to a point, and then he pulled his funding, but he changed the world. One scientist, man, woman, dog, or cat, will change life for everybody if you fund whoever is the best. Not this buddy system where, my buddy needs this contract over here, and I'm gonna give him $50 million because he's telling me he can produce fusion too. And it just doesn't work like that. Geniuses like Magwitch don't come along every day. They just don't.
Where do you think Elon Musk fits into this buddy system? And do you think that, I mean, I hate to say it, knock on wood, that something untimely could happen to Elon Musk with everything that he's been working on, the boring project underneath the earth and SpaceX and setting up universal, the idea of setting up universal internet in space so that everyone has access to it?
Well, I think Elon Musk is very progressive to make the Tesla Motors electric cars and the semi-trucks. I mean, semi-trucks running on electric is a huge breakthrough because that's where a lot of our fossil fuel and all of our money, again, keeps getting dumped into the Middle East, and we're losing the power of our dollar. I think we need to be more aggressive on the electric car front. All the motor companies need to be more aggressive on the electric car front. But I met Musk. I was at a party in Bel Air, next to Beverly Hills, and at that time I was a defense contractor working with Magwitch, and I wanted him to fund Magwitch. but there's no way to get him to understand that at that time. And the problem now is people like Richard, people say to me, because I've been on hundreds of radio shows like Coast to Coast AM with Art Bell and George Norrie. I've been on Fox News, CNN, Anderson Cooper with Dan Aykroyd. I did a film with Dan Aykroyd on flying saucers, and I got myself in the media everywhere. But everyone says, well, you need to talk to Richard Branson. You need to talk to Elon Musk. Those guys won't talk to me because maybe, again, it's that system where it's like an overprotected cell. You're a billionaire and you have all these people who work for you. They surround you like a, you're the nucleus and they're protecting you. And if so-and-so calls in, no, you can't talk to him. He's too important. You can't talk to him. And it's similar to celebrities. I personally, sat down with some pretty amazing celebrities, and Dan Aykroyd is the closest person to me. And again, it's so hard to break that barrier in their minds. I mean, you have all these billionaire celebrities and they don't know about this stuff. Yeah. They don't know how America could take this quantum leap to another level where they could say goodbye to Middle Eastern oil, bye to Middle Eastern military conflicts. There's nothing you have we want anymore. You're on your own. And this country and the Western civilization will take a quantum leap into the space age and retain its wealth.
Right, that's the thing. I would love to deep dive that topic even more. And I just in the process of reading Eric Larson's great book called Dead Wake on the sinking of the Lusitania, and you realize, Woodrow Wilson is driving around in his Pierce automobile, which is fully electric. The U-boat that takes down the Lusitania is a fully electric U-boat. We embraced we embraced battery-operated vehicles at the early part of the century, and then just got squashed and moved out completely. And we all know the story of the EVs in California in the 90s that were destroyed and shredded. And so there's been this big movement for fossil fuel for many years. And it's like now we're finally turning the corner, going back 100 years. We're finally trying to embrace electric vehicles.
Look at this, Clayton. See, when I was reading these old Bell Labs studies into the hidden properties of material science, and I'm reading about how molybdenum has the highest photoelectric conversion of any material, and I'm going, oh my God, somebody's got to use this for a solar panel. And of course, thin film solar is molybdenum. Well, it took 100 years from the point of the invention for somebody to apply it, almost 100 years. And we're sitting on data and technology in our labs that we haven't brought to fruition because a lot of these scientists look at the data and they don't even know how to apply it. Do we have anti-gravity sitting in our labs? Absolutely. I mean, I can show you interviews between Boyd Bushman and myself where it's very clear we do, although we have a radiation problem with some of the early anti-gravity experiments. And then you have the statement by Ben Rich, the former head of Lockheed Skunk Works, saying, we already have the technology to send ET back home. In a single sentence, that says, we've met ET, we have his technology, and now we know how to do what he does, all in one sentence. And again, see, for me, I'm this kid who grew up in the San Francisco Bay Area in the 60s, and my mom was a fashion model and a clothing designer and became a lawyer. My dad's is training to be this progressive psychologist. And these ETs showed me the inside, the nucleus of the power drive of how the thing worked. I wanted to know how these things work my whole life. I want to have a flying saucer. Finally, I've got an electric car parked out behind this wall. It's just a little Hyundai Kona. I love it. It's so quiet. It accelerates super fast. But I want to enter the real space age. I want to know how these beings are doing it. And I think we know way more than even this group that Tom DeLonge created knows. I think we know more than that. And here's the solution, I believe. We got to get past this idea that one of you out there is going to be the hero who figures out anti-gravity. When you study the three guys that made the transistor, John Bardeen, Will Shockley, and Will Bratton, It took all three of their minds to perfect the transistor. Once we had, I remember my first transistor radio, I went to the horse tracks with my dad and I won $4 and got my first transistor radio. Now an Intel chip has billions of transistors in it. Transistors have changed the world. They've given us the internet, telecommunications, all because three guys. Not one guy. The point is not one guy, three.
Right.
And to solve anti-gravity, I think we need everyone to come together to a table and say, here's all the data we have, and let's do this together. Stop trying to think that Tom DeLonge and his little group is going to save the world. If you had it working, it would be working now. Stephen Greer did the same thing. He came out with very profound films. He said he had the technology, and then he didn't. Well,
Right.
Let's all get together. Let's stop trying to be an island, because the greatest inventions in the history of the world were teams, like a football team. We're not one person.
Right. If we learned anything in this quarantine, watching The Last Dance on Netflix, when the Chicago Bulls finally started to win championships, is when Michael Jordan started passing the ball. Right. So I think we're going to learn.
Right, there you go.
Right.
And that's what's missing in this subject. And the other thing that destroys this subject, Clayton, is when the media keeps trivializing it, when it's probably the most exciting, important story of the 21st century.
Well, this is one of the things I've said to my old co-host Tucker Carlson. I said, I think this is the biggest story of all time. And in the early days when I was talking to Tucker about this, he said, I don't know, I don't buy it. I don't buy it. And then once we would have these deeper discussions about it, and he started interviewing people, said, I buy it. And he said, it's true, it's here, it's real, and this is the biggest story of all time. Because once you, what drives me nuts, I'm a media guy, I was in television for so many years, is these newscasts that would place it as the footer story in their news block, right? They do the murder, the fire, the bus crash,
right.
And the last story in their news block, they'd play some X-Files music and they'd say, is it a bird? Is it a plane? Well, some residents in Somerville, Ohio think that they saw a UFO, and they joke about it and blah, blah, blah.
And they joke about it, yeah.
And they would always joke about it, and they'd always play, and it always became a joke. It was always a joke, and that always drove me nuts. And so what I've really tried to aim to do with this show is to have science-based approach to this, have folks like you on the show who can really dive deep into this. So that's why it's been really special to have you here, David. So I really appreciate you taking time out.
Okay, thank you, Clayton. Good to be here. And let's stay in regular touch.
I sure hope you enjoyed this interview with David Sereda. If I brought you any value at all, go ahead and smash that like button and subscribe to our channel. And make sure you turn on that little bell notification so you'll be notified as soon as we publish another episode. Now go out there, everyone, and keep searching for the truth.